It's a room full of empaths. We're either all going to be laughing together or crying together. I'm not sure what it is, but here we are. Thank you for that, everyone. Quick introductions to our wonderful panelists, who I am humbled and very honored to be sitting next to tonight. To my left is Dorit Cypis. We laughed backstage because there's so many different ways to say it, and she said pick one, and that's what came out. So, Cypis? Cypis.
No, it's okay.
Cypis. Dorit is a multidisciplinary artist, educator, and mediator, exploring the themes of history, identity, and social relations. Welcome, Dorit.
Thank you.
And next to her is Dr. Lisa Aziz-Zadeh, and she is currently an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at USC. And she is studying different subjects that she's very interested in, including creativity, language from a cognitive neuroscience perspective, and embodied representations, which I'm not really sure what that means, but it sounds really interesting, and we can't wait to hear what it is. Welcome, Lisa. And Diana Castle, teacher and actor, teacher and coach of actors for over 30 years. Her philosophy and practical application is called The Imagined Life, which is acting as the art of the empathetic imagination. Welcome, Diana. Thank you. So just to kick us off on the right foot, you know, we hear this word empathy being thrown around a lot lately. And I'm curious for each of you, if you could tell us, just defining in your own words, what is empathy? And maybe how it's different from sympathy. Dorit, you want to answer that first?
Well, so I've been asking the question about what is empathy most of my life. And here it is in the public domain. How great is that? I think empathy is an essential human quality, which we lose very easily. I think that empathy is has to start from within. I believe in my explorations and work, I've seen empathy often misused or misunderstood. In fact, I can just share a short story. I thought I was empathic when I worked for about 9 years with homeless teenagers in Minneapolis. As an artist, I understood that survival needed to be bridged with inspiration so that you don't just survive, that you're an inspired survivor, which is a very different form of living. And I work with teens and other artists. I brought artists in to work with teens because artists are inspired. And these teens knew how to survive. I remember standing on stage with about 20 of them. They were going to be performing. And I got hit with an understanding of empathy at that moment. I don't know why it came to me at a moment where I had to introduce them. And I realized that I had misunderstood it. I thought that my work with them and my thinking that I understood them was false. I wanted to save them. And to save someone is not to be empathic. And empathy needs, I believe, an open heart and an open mind that understands one's own position as not the position of the other. You can't stand in the other person's shoes, only they can. That's why we were created in individual bodies. But you can have a sense of where they may be coming from, but never confuse that with you thinking that you're feeling what they're feeling. You're not. That's the difference.
So I'll talk about it from a psychology perspective. So in psychology, we actually make 3 distinctions. So we have cognitive empathy, we have emotional, affective empathy, and then we have something else that's called compassion. So there's actually 3 categories. So cognitive empathy is what you would call sympathy. Cognitive empathy is essentially perspective taking, so putting yourself mentally in someone else's space. So seeing the world from their eyes from a very cognitive, very deliberate, very thoughtful place where you're really thinking about what they're thinking. And then affective empathy is a completely different thing. It's emotional resonance. So it's feeling what the other person is feeling. So for example, if you see someone cut their hand with a knife, you actually could feel the pain that they're in, right? So that's emotional resonance. It's not exactly the pain, but it's some quality of what they're feeling. And then the final one is compassion. And compassion is a little step further. Compassion is not just resonance. You don't just feel what the other person feels, but you want to comfort and you want to take that person to a different place. So compassion is a motivational space. It's a motivational drive to do something for the other person. So those are the three distinctions that we make in psychology.
In thinking about this, you know, all of us in this room were born with an empathic nature. But there's a nurture, the nurture part of it. So my first experience with empathy was with my parents. And, you know, I'm just so grateful to them for exposing me to the arts and gifting me with the opportunity to explore a whole bunch of different artistic avenues. And I know why that was, because they really looked at the arts as a kind of beacon of beauty and truth and hope, and that was because they experienced so many terrors. My father had just turned 18 years old, and he lived in Warsaw, Poland, and when the Nazis invaded. And he saw his grandparents, his father, his mother, and his sister murdered. My mother, excuse me, was 14 and living in London, and when the bombs were dropping, the Blitz. And so they were both really living in the effect of this annihilative tendency that exists inside of all of our lives. And then they came to New York City and emigrated, you know, after the war, and had me, and things were, you know, we were living in primarily a Jewish neighborhood, and I was experiencing all of the diversity and all of the arts, you know, in New York City. And then at the age of 10, I was 10, my family decided to move to South Carolina. This is the 60s. Yeah. So, and then the bottom dropped out in our home. The trauma that my parents had endured came forward. And, and then I began to experience what it was like to be other. I began to experience living in the effect of that annihilative force that exists inside of everybody. And so what happened was, you know, I just really began to experience this thing that we're calling empathy as a courageous engagement with life itself. That empathy really gifts us with the opportunity to bring out our potential. And our potential can't be realized unless we are engaged with other people. We can't access and actualize our potential without it, without that engagement. So empathy is an experience of interconnection. It's an experience of interdependency. It's definitely taking a walk in another person's shoes, but what we come to find out is that the shoes exist in our own closet. And that this idea of other is inside of us. That was the lesson I had to learn about that annihilative force that existed inside of my own life. And sympathy, sympathy, right? Sympathy is I think sympathy is more like, I'm so sorry, that you have to wear those shoes. You know what I mean? I'm not going to take a walk in the shoes. I'm just going to say, I'm so sorry that you're wearing them. I can see they're sorry shoes. But the thing about those sorry shoes is that not only am I sorry for those shoes, but I'm also saying, I'm also imposing, and what Dorit was talking about, I'm imposing my own personal narrative onto this person's experience. I'm not willing to exchange interpretive frameworks. I'm unwilling to do that. When I think about empathy in actors, because we're in a room full of mostly actors, right? Yeah? Okay, so there's this great quote by Henrik Ibsen, and Ibsen, of course, was the Norwegian playwright, and he wrote a couple of good parts for women. And he said, this is one of my favorite quotes in the world, and it really inspires me on a daily basis. He said, these people, the politicians, they want outward revolutions, political readjustments, special revolutions. All of this is inconsequential. The only revolution that counts is a revolution of the human spirit. I think that actors are on the front lines of that revolution. I think what actors do is revolutionary, what you guys do. You stand on the front lines of that battle between the I am not and the I am, the empathic I am. The place that says, okay, when you fall, I fall. When you win, I win. And also some of our baser nature, there's some connective tissue there too. But yeah, I love actors. I love actors.
Lisa, can you tell us a little bit more about what's actually happening in the brain when we choose to empathize with somebody else?
Yeah, for sure. So let's go back to those distinctions because they actually have neural bases, and each one is a different network in the brain. So when we sympathize with another person or when we take perspective of another person, we actually activate parts of our brain that are involved in mentalizing, in thinking and deductive reasoning. So it's the prefrontal cortex, as well as some areas in the junction between the parietal and the temporal, so right about there. And so those are the areas that are active when I try to put myself in your shoes. Instead, when we have affective empathy, so when we're resonating with someone else's emotions, when we feel what they feel, we activate the same regions that are active when we ourselves are having that experience. So for example, when I'm in pain, I activate what's called the pain matrix. It's a network of areas that are subcortical. And when I see you in pain, I activate exactly those same regions. So it's as if I'm putting your emotions into my own areas that process my emotions, and I become you for a moment. I share your feelings. And then compassion is a separate network. And so compassion actually involves the feel-good regions of the brain. So the orbitofrontal cortex, which is orbitofrontal, right under your eyes, and the striatum, which is a dopamine network. And so dopamine is a feel-good neurotransmitter. So these are parts of our brain that actually make us feel good. So compassion, you can think about the feeling like a mother has for her child, right? So that's a very compassionate state. And it's a feel-good state. It's a state that you want to be in.
And so how do you know when you're empathizing, or maybe where do you begin? Any of you talk about some practical exercises that would get the brain moving in a place where you move into empathizing?
I'll jump on that because of this cognitive, emotional, and compassionate empathy. For actors, well, there's a story. You know the Makan tribe, right? Yeah, have you ever heard of them? Anybody know the Makan tribe? Well, some of my students here, I can see them, they know. But the Makan tribe is a tribe in the Andaman Seas. And they're a fascinating tribe. But they've got a story that's been passed down for generations. It's a spoken word story about the big wave, the big man-eating wave at the tsunami. And the angry man-eating wave, I think they call it. And it's been passed down through spoken word, obviously. If you can learn it by heart, you'll survive. Empathy, right? Mirror neurons, face to face, life to life, heart to heart, right? If you write it down on a piece of paper, of course, that's going to get lost. So 60 Minutes was interested in the Makan tribe because they were the sole survivors of the 2004 tsunami. Remember that? Yeah. So many people lost their lives because it was at Christmas. And so when 60 Minutes interviewed the leader of the tribe, they have many signs for when the big wave is coming, and two of them that he mentioned on 60 Minutes were this: that the water level will rise to a certain point, and that the cicadas will stop singing. And so on that day, he recognized the signs, and the entire tribe went to the designated spot, and they were all safe. So I think it was Bob Simon who said, okay, we get why the tourists didn't see the signs. But why didn't the fishermen, your compatriots in the water, they're in the water with you? And this chief of the tribe said in his profound wisdom, because the fishermen can only see the fish. So that's the danger of holding on to a personal narrative in acting. You can't see the signs in the script. You can't even see sometimes what the script is about by holding on to the personal narrative. It's about being willing to exchange narratives and step into what I call the empathic I am, which means you're willing to see more than the fish. You're willing to step out and into an alternative of self. So I always say that every part is a part of us. It's not a part we're becoming. It's a name on the page for an aspect of us. And like I said earlier, we sometimes have to dig kind of deep in the closet to find those old shoes. And sometimes we go, oh my gosh, I don't know what these shoes are. I don't own these shoes. I don't know what these shoes are. But ultimately, through the work, you come to an understanding. And so when an actor meets a script, the words, because the written word and the spoken word happen in two different places in the brain, right? So when you look at a script, there's first the mirror reflecting back to the actor the potential of self, which would be the cognitive. I understand this. You don't have to understand it, though. Just it's about acceptance, right? And just saying, I'm willing to say yes to this. I don't have to understand first. Just I'm willing to say yes to this as a possibility of myself. And that this name is a name for a potential self, right? I'm willing to step in and say, this is a potential for me. So that's the cognitive side. Now, if you keep staring at the words and saying them over and over again, and looking in the mirror, you're kind of Narcissus, right? You just kind of keep looking in the mirror at yourself and imagining how you're playing it and how you're saying it, It's just like you can't stop, you start to become very self-conscious, very self-aware, which is the worst for an actor, right? The worst feeling. So we want to open the door to the portal of the life beyond the language, the story beyond the statement. And in doing that, that's an empathic experience of emotional empathy. And the actor sits in that emotional empathic experience for a little while until they wake up through that vulnerability, the desire to take action or compassionate action, right? On behalf of the story and in the story, right? You wake up to your mission in the story, and also you wake up to your mission for the story, whatever that might be. So there's sort of three parts to the words. One is a mirror, one is a portal, and then the words become a tool to take action. And then to take the action, to get your vulnerabilities, to get the endings that you need, and to negotiate the traumas that you're in, and corroborate some beliefs, core beliefs, and experience the infantile needs. And there's a third part, which is the experience of feeling connected beyond the camera, with the set, connected with your audience in the theater. And that connection happens because now you know that the story that's in you is in everybody else. It's in everybody else. So you're not meeting a producer or director, whatever it is. You're meeting another human being, and whatever the story is that you've empathized with, that exists in everybody, and then the mirror neurons fire when you walk into an office. Yeah.
So interesting listening to both of you.
Do I sound like I need water? That's just my crackly old voice. I don't smoke, but I used to, long time ago.
She's proud of it. I was going to say, it's interesting listening to both your perspectives, coming from a very different place. All of us come from three very different places. So I was trained as a visual artist, and I was trained very heavily on perceptual skills and relational skills in terms of understanding context. And self and other were always a huge part of meaning and understanding. And I learned very early on that fixed identity is a myth, that it's constructed for us, and we buy into it, whether you call it any of the categories that we always have to check off on these forms. I actually created a chart that I use when I teach, how to break down the notion of diversity into difference. And difference is way more subtle and human. Diversity is constructed. And guess what? We are diverse. That is utterly human. And thank God, because we each have something different to bring to the table. Never mind our categories. Sometimes I'll put on the whiteboard, 7 categories of the diversities that we've been taught: race, class, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, age, ability, mental and physical ability. You can check those off. Often we think we know the other by looking at them. I know how to check off all your categories, I think, right? Then I put down another column next to that column, and I put down 7 other categories of identity. And there's millions, of course, but I've used over 40 years 7: myth, memory, history, fantasy, dream, family, desire. And there's 7 categories that are externally constructed, and 7 categories that are noumenal, luminous, that are harder to define. You can't see it on the surface. And I'll ask individuals to choose a category in each column, connect them with a straight line, and tell a story, which is who we are. And it's endless, and we can never look at the other, just through the categories we've learned. And I know when I teach, empathy is a goal. It's not ABC, this is how you do it. It's a goal. What does it take to get there? Understanding of equity. What is equity? It's difference. Your difference may not be equal to my difference, but it is what it is. Equity is, what do you need to support your difference? Not about equality. I need the same as you. We each need different things depending on where we sit, what our backgrounds have been, what we need resource-wide. So equity is essential, I think, to building bridges towards that long-range goal of empathy. And the other one I would say is reciprocity. that, and you spoke about reciprocity in terms of there's no such thing without an exchange. So imagine yourself as the only person in the world. Would you need an identity? No. We need an identity in order to relate to the other. An identity is as fluid as there are people in the world. Because who I am to you, if we struck up more of a relationship than this, would be different than who I would be to you, or to you, or to you. Because we bring out aspects of ourselves, the narratives, the subjectivities, the lived experiences filtered through whatever it was that developed us. You know, Roland Barthes, the wonderful French philosopher, you know, once said, yeah, we're all the same in a few ways. We're all born. We all need to play in life. We procreate. We, create families. He said this in the 70s. So we create very kinds of different families, and we die. But how are we born? Where are we born? To what circumstances are we born in? I don't need to say more than that. It's just that our differences, to me, are our humanity. And empathy cannot happen without a clear, open safety. I think you need to feel safe with yourself in order to open to the difference of the other. And usually you'll find that the difference of the other, as you said, mirrors something about yourself that you may not know, be blind to, haven't yet teased out, processed, developed, another voice, another narrative. So when I teach how to break down an understanding of yourself. Because I think the key to understanding the other is you, is not the other. And if you take you out of the equation, 99% it's going to be assumption, presumption, projection, your desire, your fantasy, your anger, your fear, not what the other person is feeling.
Diana, both you and Dorit have mentioned, you talked about the script being a mirror to reflect oneself, and you, I think, used the term referring to resonance. And you also both use the term mirror neurons. And I'm just wondering if you talk a little bit about, what's happening? Because we use these terms, but what does that mean, mirror neurons, and why is that important in the art of acting and storytelling?
Okay, great. So mirror neurons was my work for the last 20 years, so this is perfect. So mirror neurons is a special case of what we call the shared circuits in the brain. So let's start with mirror neurons and we'll work toward shared circuits. So mirror neurons were first discovered in monkeys. And it was found they were recording single cells in the brain of a monkey in the premotor cortex. So these are cells that are active when the monkey makes an action. So the monkey's reaching for food, and right, you hear the sound of the firing. And this was a study that was done in Parma, Italy, with Rizzolatti's group. And what they found was very by accident that when the experimenter reached for the piece of food, all of a sudden the neuron went crazy as well. So this was a neuron in the motor cortex. So it's really, from what we thought in neuroscience, it should just be active when the monkey does something himself. That's it. It was active when the monkey saw someone else make the same action. So it's a representation in a single neuron for self and other. In humans, it's now been discovered that also humans have an equivalent of the mirror neuron system. In humans, it's much more difficult to test this because we can't actually put an electrode in a single neuron and measure it. So we do brain imaging, and so we think we find what are similar to mirror neurons in monkeys. And these mirror neurons in humans have actually been correlated with trait empathy. So the more empathetic you are, you seem to activate your mirror system more. They're also active for different kinds of things. So for example, they're active for just the sound of an action. So if you hear someone tearing paper, the same neuron that you use to tear paper yourself, when you actually physically tear paper, is active. So it's a multi-represented neuron with sound, with auditory, with vision, and with motor. So since then, it's been found that outside the motor cortex, you also have these kinds of shared representations. So for example, in part of the brain that we call the somatosensory cortex, it's the part of your brain that's active when you're touched, so when you're physically touched, is also active when you see someone else being touched. So we all have had the experience of seeing a spider crawl in someone else's skin, right? And we feel the tingle ourselves as if it's happening to us. It's from this kind of resonance that we have in our somatosensory cortex. And then another really important one for empathy is the emotion regions. So as we said a little earlier, that the emotion regions, the areas that are active for pain, are active when I feel pain and when you feel pain. That we have that kind of resonance, and all of this is automatic. We don't have to think about it in the typical person. In people whose brains are different, it's a different story. And let me think. So the emotion processing area, so pain, happiness, joy, anger, all of that is shared in this kind of way.
And there's also linguistic empathy, in other words, when you look at the language.
Right. So there are some studies that show that when you just listen to words, that say, for example, let's go back to mirror neurons. So if you hear the word kick, you activate your regions as if you were kicking a ball.
And also if you read it, correct? Mm-hmm. If you read it,
right.
When you read the word.
Exactly.
I went swimming yesterday, and you imagine doing that.
Right. And all of this is
You're
implicit.
experiencing it.
Yeah.
I wish I could lose 40 pounds just thinking about it. Just think about swimming, it'd be okay.
You know,
It's not
it's
the way it works.
interesting you're talking about neurology, and I've been very interested in neurobiology and how, what is the extended affect of the brain in the body. And that, and I'm especially interested in the GI system. Mm. And I've learned and done a lot of reading recently. It's kind of fascinating.
It is fascinating. Yeah.
You know? I mean, okay. Does anybody here take antidepressants? Oh, nobody, okay. I guess I'll just speak about myself. So in my belly, I found out, you know, you think that you're taking these magic little antidepressant pills to, what is the uptake inhibitor, in your brain, the neurology, right, to shift the balance, the chemistry. Well, guess what? There's as many of those, whatever that is, in your belly. Right. So depression is not just of course it's not just in the brain. Of course it's in the body. The somatic nature of emotion is fascinating. You talked about embodied representation. I've done a lot of work with dancers who are fascinated by somatic awareness and teach, whether it's continuum or authentic movement or Feldenkrais. There's so many different modalities of listening to the body's own sense of knowledge or sense of knowing or memory, you know, cellular somatic memory why, when I get angry, does it always hurt here? Why, when I'm really deep in grief, does it always choke me up here? You know, that this is not a separate organ. You know, that it's a simultaneous working thing. And so another thread to asking the question, how do you work towards empathy, is somatically. How do you open yourself to listen to your own body? Because knowing yourself is certainly not just cognitive.
Yeah.
And the emotions live in the body, and so does your memory. So opening oneself to one's own habits or patterns or impasses or internalized conflicts, because I work with conflict resolution. By the way, I don't buy it. I don't buy conflict resolution. Conflict's not intended to resolve. It's just intended to be engaged with, because conflict is normal and human and needed. It's as it's as present as my breathing is present. Okay? And so is bias, by the way. Bias is not just a bad thing. It's utterly human. When we become more and more aware of how we've internalized bias and are no longer steering it, but it's steering us, then we're causing affective problems. And that's another way to opening towards empathy, is to understand your own unrecognized biases. Because your biases usually will be covered over with your own subjective patterns or habits of avoidance, desire, accommodation, assumption, reactive patterns rather than responsive patterns.
So are you saying before you can actually, before you can empathize with somebody else, are you saying that you actually have to be healthy yourself? Or you're saying complete? Can you break that down a little bit more?
Well, I'm not speaking in any ideals. There is no key steps and now you've got it. It's a lifelong process, and so is empathy. It's not that's it. To me, it's an unfolding process of experiencing the other. It's not I got it, I've done it, I did it, I know that person.
So that could be really frustrating for an actor who gets a call from their agent
Right.
at 4 p.m. on a Thursday, needs to show up at Paramount the next morning and have 7 pages of dialogue memorized.
Yeah.
Real challenge.
Yeah. My experience with actors has been that with every story, the more that they willingly accept the conditions of the story, and I might use some of your list. I like it. But the more they accept the conditions of the story, that they come to know themselves better. In other words, art really illuminates our lives, right? So this idea that somehow my life is going to illuminate the art, I find it to be the other way around. I find it to be the other way around with actors, that when they willingly step into an alternative reality, when they step into play, which is, the play spirit, which is that wonderful place of exploring possibilities, that they come to a deeper grasp of who they are through that process. Yeah.
So maybe another way to answer your question is the work doesn't begin when you first read the script. It's ongoing.
It's ongoing. It's cumulative, yeah, definitely. Every
Ongoing.
script.
And the more work you do, the better you are at reading the next script,
Yeah,
period.
definitely.
Doesn't begin with the script.
You take with you what you've empathized with in one story into the next story. It can be a completely different script or circumstances.
You take with you your inner growth.
Yeah.
Tell that to your agents. So here's a question. Empathy, when we're talking about it, sometimes can sound like an ideal. Wouldn't that be nice if we were able to just take off our shoes and walk in somebody else's? Wouldn't the world be a much better place? Wouldn't we have peaceful conversations, more evolved conversations confronting conflict instead of resolving them?
Never confront conflict.
What was the term you used?
Be open to engaging
in it. So what happens when, as an actor, we're faced with a role of a villain or somebody maybe that we don't want to go there? What do you do?
So,
Oh, she's looking. Well, I mean, you know, actors know that there's no villain. There's just a person, a contradictory, paradoxical human being. And the enemy of, you know, the real villainous aspect of, I think, is just the lack of willingness to empathize. I mean, if there's any enemy to empathy, it's a lack of willingness to even step in and say, you know, what is your experience? What are your beliefs? What are your feelings? So, yeah, I don't think of the villain or the hero. You know, actors know that would be a one-note experience, and you know, they're like musicians. They need to be symphonic in their experience of things.
But can't a character that's been written to be acted out scare an actor because it's
Certainly.
pressing on something psychologically deeply unresolved in them?
Definitely.
What do you do with that?
Well, you know, the first step is acceptance, right? That just, I don't need to understand it, and I know that this scares me, but we know, right, when we build like walls or I'm scared, threat, right? The perception of threat is when the fear comes up. The reward for the actor, when they can perceive the reward of stepping in, then they can move through the threat. And as the rewards for actors are having the experience, the play, the experience of possibility. Yeah.
So there's recently been a series of studies that have been done on empathy and how we can improve empathy and expand it to not just our in-group, the people that we want to empathize with, but also to the out-group, the people we usually don't think of as like us. And these studies basically focus on what we call compassionate meditation. It's also called loving kindness meditation. Some of you might be familiar with it. And basically it goes something like this. So first, when you start to meditate, you first focus on someone who you symbolize as your source of someone you feel compassionate with. So for example, for a mother, again, it could be the child, and you focus on when your child is smiling at you in that loving way that just makes your heart melt, right? In the traditional practice, it was you would bring up the picture of your mother, and you would focus on your mother as someone who can elicit this natural compassion from you. The mother is a complicated figure in Western culture, so you can bring up your pet or whatever. But the idea is you start there. So you start with this person who elicits this natural compassion from you, this natural empathy, this natural loving kindness, and then once you've harbored this and you've explored this and you've really brought this to full fruition, then you can start to extend this to other people in your circle. So the postman, the secretary at your work, your Uber driver, right? And you start to think about these people and you extend that same feeling toward these people. Once you've reached that point, then you go beyond that circle to your outgroup, to people who you don't usually, your Uber driver might be the same race, might be the same religion, but someone else might not be. And then you start to pass it on that way. Finally, the last phase is to have this kind of loving kindness, compassion for people who you are in a conflict situation with. Your ex-wife, right? Your boss at work or someone you're having conflict with. And once you've harnessed this feeling so strongly, you start to focus on this person and expressing compassion and loving kindness toward this person. And we find actually in neuroscience studies and brain imaging studies that people who are very good at this actually show a lot of compassion activations, the ones that we talked about before, the compassion network, when they're looking at people in pain from outgroups or people who they say are they're in conflict with. So it does seem to work. And also this kind of training actually increases cortical thickness. So the gray matter, the outside part of your brain, that where all the neuron cell bodies actually are, gets thicker in these networks.
Is that good?
That's good. So those brain areas are getting bigger in essence. Yeah.
So do you think that then if this idea, well, I mean, the experience that I've had is when an actor really accepts a story as their own, yeah, and enters the empathic experience, and then they start to see that story, recognizing that that world exists in everybody.
Right. So for the villain, the idea is to then have that loving kindness, compassion, right? So you're not seeing them as the villain, but have it coming from a place that's rooted in love.
Yeah, and then you see it in everybody. You know, the actor comes in and says, I'm meeting a big producer. I said, well, you're already in a hierarchical construct. You're already made this person big. That means, what does that mean about you? So the language then is reflective rather than, okay, this is a human being that I'm meeting, and the story that I'm telling is a story about hierarchical constructs, let's say. And so now I'm not just looking at a human being that I'm calling a big producer or a big director, but now I'm looking at another human being who's in a hierarchical construct. And I can see that world. It's you know, Shakespeare said it best, right? Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. The idea that, you know, if you can really see it, you can see it in everybody, right? And then your reactive self, or the part of you that's reacting, is not reacting to what's in front of you, but reacting to the person that you see or that you perceive. What is he to Hecuba and Hecuba to him that he should weep for her? The best question ever asked in the art of acting, right? What is it about this woman Hecuba and what she's been through in terms of war and losing all of her children and her husband? How come the old player, you know, the pre-show guy, before we catch the conscience of the king, that old pre-show guy comes out, you know, like the warm-up guy in sitcoms. And you know, and he has this experience with this imaginary being. And Hamlet asked that question, right? What's he to Hecuba and Hecuba to him that he should weep for her? So it's the same idea, you know. Who are you to me and me to you that I should weep for you? You know, it's being able to see that part of you. So it's the same kind of idea, I think, right? Yeah.
So then as we're working towards building a brain that is capable of empathizing more and more. Body brain?
Yeah, body brain.
Body and
mind
brain,
and body are
right?
one, right? Mind
Well,
and
specific to the brain with the neural pathways ring for
connected to.
I have to say that she's absolutely right. So emotions are not emotions if you don't have a body, right? So the way that we know we're scared is because our heart beats, and we start to sweat. And William James, who's the father of modern psychology, he actually had a thought experiment. If you walk into an alley and you don't have your heart beating fast and you don't have your breath increasing, are you scared? Mm-hmm. And the answer actually from a series of psychology experiments seems to show that you won't be. So it's this physiological response that is translated to the brain by the insula and other parts of the brain as it's interpreted. So the physiology, the viscera, all the internal organs are going up to the brain, sending their signals, and then that's interpreted as a feeling.
So really choosing to do that is a big deal for a human, for an actor, to be a professional empathizer. Mm-hmm. To allow their whole body and brain, what you're saying, everything to be lended over to the humanity of another character is quite a big deal. How do you keep from letting that seep into your own life if you're continually, empathizing with these other characters? Do you compartmentalize?
Well, there's the I am Diana. I mean, in order to empathize, right, you have to have a sense of your own self in the world. That's how it happens, right, the subject-object. But I may say I'm Diana, but I'm also the I am, the empathic I am can say I'm willing to step in. So I always think of it as two sides of the same piece of paper upon which the whole story's written. There's the side of me that's willing to step in and empathize, and then there's the side that's empathizing. And I don't think that, I think it ought to, it ought to bleed, because it's sort of like when you go on a vacation and then you come back from that vacation. When you go on a vacation, let's say to Poland, you're not going to bring a map of the United States with you. You'll be lost. You're going to step into the culture and step into the values of the people in let's see, wherever you're visiting in Poland. But when you come back to your own life, you come back refreshed. You can see your own life better because you empathized with another human being.
So we see that when we put someone in the scanner, as we said, so you see someone in pain, you activate your own pain network, right? Mm-hmm. So now you put a doctor, okay, so someone who constantly sees people in pain. And you actually see that in physicians, they don't show the same amount of activity in this pain network. And they can't, right? I mean, they have to block this to some degree. They see pain so often, right? So when I see someone getting surgery in a movie, I can't actually look. It's like too much for me to process. But a physician probably could, and it wouldn't be the same for him. So that actually can become a problem, because if in physicians and in actors, I assume, when you have this kind of blunting, then it can lead to burnout, and it can lead to lack of empathy for your patients and so forth. And so really the way around this is to, again, go to loving kindness, compassion, right? So it's been shown that in people who do this kind of meditation and who focus on loving kindness, compassion, don't need to have that kind of blunting of emotions. Instead, they start to activate these feel-good networks in the brain when they see people in pain, because it's not that they're just resonating that emotion, they're feeling like, what can I do, right? And so when you come from it in this different space, in this different motivational drive, where you're not just resonating, but you're trying to push the other person higher, then you lose the burnout and you actually go beyond.
Mm-hmm. That's the two sides to the work of an actor. They do the vulnerability work at home, which is more emotionally empathic, but then they wake up the compassionate action, and then when action is called, they're doing something on behalf of the vulnerability of the human being. Yeah.
That's interesting. When I spoke earlier about working with the homeless kids, teenagers, and for the first 2 years, it was addictive working with them, because I'd never seen young children in such vulnerable predicaments. It was to be there and to know you had something to give and to something to offer is addictive. It's like you just want to do it. Or I did anyway. I won't talk about you, but I'll talk about, not everybody. But I realized when I spoke earlier about how I thought I was empathic, and then I realized that it wasn't empathy. When I recognized the difference between wanting to save them and recognizing who they were and what circumstances they were in, and respecting that, it was a completely different note of empathy.
Yeah,
and
not
there's a
codependency.
separation there. You're both present and separated, and it's like a Zen koan. You're there, and you're not there. You're neutral and you're embedded. You're outside and you're inside. And keeping that balance is a key.
It's good. I'm like taking it all in. I want to make sure we get in all these questions before we take a few questions from you guys. I have a few here. So can you talk a little bit more about what's the value of practicing empathy in day-to-day life outside of acting and art? Really, you know, how can you develop the habit? How can you access it more readily and make it second nature so that it doesn't become so, big or hard?
I mean, I can start. So again, in neuroscience, there's been 3 that have been really looked at. So we talked a lot about the loving kindness meditation, but there's also something called perspective taking. So these are daily practices that you have to do for, at least the studies that looked at this had people do this for 20 minutes a day. And so, right.
We're laughing
Students are laughing because they do it for an hour a day. Because it usually takes about 40 minutes to get that 20 minutes.
That's true.
What about the actual 20 minutes?
So, okay, so either you're doing this compassionate loving kindness meditation, which we talked about, or you could do perspective taking, where you not only look at yourself from a bird's eye view and try to understand your thought patterns, your motivations, your drives in a non-judgmental way, but you also do it for other people. And again, you can go through different people in your life. And then the third one is something that you've talked a lot about, which is just being with yourself in the present and trying to go through your emotions in a non-judgmental way and what you're physically feeling at any moment. But I have to say that the studies show that the other 2, you have to start out. First of all, you do have to start out with this kind of meditation, but you also have to grow from it to either this kind of compassion meditation or this perspective taking. And both of them are very effective for empathizing and increasing pro-social behavior.
Sometimes when you think about meditation, it's sort of an eyes-closed event and about the self. And since the art of acting is so much about not just the personal self, but about the we of the I am, active imagination is an eyes-open event, right? It's keeping the eyes open and activating a part of self that will take action. So when my students sit and imagine, they sit with their eyes open, like when you wonder or you worry. Worrying is one of those things that actors do a lot, and when they replace the worry about their own, personal reality and start to worry about the situation that they're in the story, or wonder about it, or wish for some things in the story, that eyes open activation really sets them in motion as opposed to an eyes closed meditation.
We have a few questions from our participants here in the audience that I think will reflect a lot of what we were going to get to at the end about what's causing some of the empathy deficit that we're experiencing in our culture today. What are some of the triggers for that? Or actually, why don't we start with that before we go into there? We're living in a culture where we know there is a deficit is real. What do you think is the cause of this?
So I'll just talk about data, because that's what I feel most grounded about talking about. So we know that that there's been a drop in reading for pleasure. So for the first time, 50%, less than 50% of people actually say they read for pleasure, which is really unusual. People have always read for pleasure, right? And there's a huge correlation between reading fiction and empathy. So in preschoolers, it's been found that the more stories preschoolers read, the better they are at recognizing emotions in other people. It's also been found that the more fiction adults read, the higher they score in empathy measures. The other thing is loneliness. We know lonelier people are more judgmental, are more vindictive, are lower in empathy in general.
Also, people in power.
Also, people
Right?
in
They don't
power.
have the incentive for empathy. Yeah, and that enduring works of literature, you know, that whole idea that when you're reading a novel, classic novel or Chekhov, there was a study done that, you know, people who read Chekhov do better on dates because they're more empathic. But they're just more empathic. Yeah, Anton. But the reason for that is they say that it's because, the researchers have said that it's because, works of literature that are enduring are more investigating the psychological, spiritual, and emotional life of the person, as opposed to some of the more kind of pop culture novels that are action-driven or plot-driven. And I know in our industry, right, we've got action films, as opposed to character-driven films, as if somehow, you know, watching an action film doesn't mean the person's vulnerable. You know, our mirror neurons are going to fire anyway if we watch Superman, you know, leap a tall building in a single bound. But we're going to go through a lot more if we know there's kryptonite in the building, right? So, so the idea that you know, action without vulnerability isn't really worth watching. The idea that, you know, entertainment really is empathy, you know, in our business.
I think I think the question you just asked is monumental, and I think we have to look at our history. We have to look at runaway capitalism. We have to look at how our culture, which was supposedly based on democracy, and never really truly was, because so many people were hurt. So you ask, where is empathy? You have to, depends where you're looking, who you're asking, you know, who has been bestowed that it's okay to give it to that group and who are not. I mean, I think it's a huge question that's mired up in economics, in politics, in greed, individuality, you know, the rise of the individual in our culture is false. You can't just achieve your own success. It doesn't work. I mean, look at our president. It's like, it doesn't work, you know, and he's like an embodied representation of it not working. But we've all been living in the tapestry of that society, and we've all agreed to it. And here in this room, we have the capacity to even be here and to even be talking about empathy. It can sound pretentious to some other groups who are not here. So I think we have to be careful. How we talk about this subject is huge. And I think this is part empathy, because empathy is about understanding complicity, that you're never outside of the other person's suffering, and that often you are part of that suffering.
We'll keep going on that more specifically. This is a question from Hilty and Riley. It's actually for Diana. Has the influx of technology and social media lessened or expanded access to empathy?
Well, I always encourage this, you know, whenever I'm teaching, I always encourage the students to turn off the phones because it's created, we know about brain hacking. We know that Silicon Valley has got us checking that phone every 7 minutes. So it's created a distracted mind. And actors have difficulty sustaining interest. I've seen that in the last 10 years, a challenge with just sustained interest. There was once a casting director who said, you know, I wish actors would stop trying to be interesting and get interested. Right. Exactly. So sustained interest begins first with acceptance and then the curiosity to enter. And then, of course, being more interested in the subject than in one's own performance. But the challenge of all of that, of course, now is that we have to, you know, you're on that TV show and you're tweeting for that television show. Right, and it's part of your job. I mean, really, part of your job. There's students who come to class and they have to sit out in the lobby for an hour because they're live tweeting for their show. So those are challenges, definitely, that actors are faced with. But I just say turn off the phones at least for an hour a day to sit in the vulnerability work and turn off the phones as much as possible, so that we can have a direct engagement with each other and have a life-to-life, heart-to-heart experience with each other instead of sort of this false connection, you know, via this thing that has really made us less connected than ever. There's some thought around the fact that it's, you know, we're more honest with each other sometimes in a text than we would be face-to-face. But Louis C.K., one time, he said something great on Jimmy Kimmel. He said, you know, when he was a kid, he would go up to somebody and say, "You're fat." And they would have to, you know, he'd have to endure the consequences of that action. Now, he said, now kids get to go, "You're fat," and that feels good. You know, I don't have to endure the consequences of those mirror neurons. So I think that's one of the challenges, you know, that we face today is just engaging with each other, you know, just getting together face to face, and instead of, you know, texting each other, picking up the phone and hearing each other's voice, seeing each other's face. That's my answer. It's a simple answer, but it's my answer to in my own life and in the life with my students is just, let's just turn off the phones tonight and let's just sit and be together and talk about things away from this distraction. You know, it'll be there when we, you know, when we get home. It'll be there.
Okay, this one is from RJ. Can desensitization of gore from years and years of watching horror films lead to burnout? If so, should I quit watching one of my favorite genres in order to regain strengthening empathy? Or is there another way?
That's interesting.
It's a real question.
It's interesting.
I would ask, what was there to begin with to make you addicted to watching horror films? Because your answer is probably there.
RJ? Okay, this one's from, anybody else? Anybody else? This one's from Ty Brenneman for Lisa. Empathy has been found to be lacking in narcissistic people. Can narcissistic people access empathy?
Okay, so can they access empathy? So we know from a couple studies that the brain areas that are active in narcissists are a little different than in other people. So they show actually less activity in these areas for perspective taking, for thinking about other people, for thinking also about themselves in a way, which is unusual. But maybe I could also expand that to psychopaths. because we actually know a lot more about psychopaths and empathy. So psychopaths have cognitive empathy. They don't have affective empathy. So they can think about other people's mental states, and they can think about their motivations and other people's drives. They can do that actually very well. But they don't have the affective component, so they don't have this resonance where they feel what you feel. And so that's something that is lacking in psychopaths, and can it be remedied is still a question. So they have what we would call sympathy. They can think about other people's, they can do perspective taking. They can think about someone else's perspective, but they don't feel what other people are experiencing.
And do you know the neurological explanation or the difference between what you named a psychopath and a narcissist?
So this kind of work has, there's not that many studies in it, and a lot of the studies show very different findings. So it could also be that the types of psychopaths vary, which is true. Like, we do know that there are highly anxious psychopaths and psychopaths who are not anxious at all, and they seem to be completely different. There's white-collar psychopaths, and there's violent psychopaths, right? So all of this is probably related to differences in brain activations and brain pathologies, but we're still really figuring out these details.
This is for the whole panel, and fitting to follow that. Is it dangerous to become another person, especially a disturbed character in a film? And the role they referenced was like Heath Ledger in The Joker.
I just think about Anthony Hopkins when he was interviewed by Charlie Rose, and Charlie Rose said to him, isn't it just terrible? You're eating people alive and stuffing their kidneys in the freezer. And Anthony Hopkins' little shiny eyes said, "Oh no, it's great fun." I mean, why not? I mean, it's imagined possibility, and why not? I mean, it's playing pretend. Ultimately, it's a child's game. Ultimately, it's a game that children play, and it's very healthy to play that game. It's a lot of fun.
Well, Dorit,
acting is fun.
Didn't you even mention earlier that it was an actual need to play? Wasn't play part of the needs that you were talking about?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So play as an actor. I mean, Diana, you talk about that a lot in your class,
Yeah,
really
play
entering the
spirit.
playground, the play spirit.
Yeah, and it's a safe space. So the play spirit is not this literal space that we're entering, but it's the space in the mind. It says, well, I'm going to explore this possibility and jump in and play,
What if you're an actor and you don't know you have psychopathic tendencies?
Oh, I haven't worked with any of those. No, I'm kidding.
Maybe that's where the question's coming from. I don't know, because it's not a given just because you're an actor that you're mentally balanced.
But what I have found, this is really true. What I have found really, and which is why I love working with actors so much, is what I found is that the more actors accept and play and allow the possibilities, the more balanced they become. I've had it's almost 30 years now of student after student after student after student who talk about, just the other day, a young woman who said to me, I went home to visit my family, and for the first time I was able to really empathize with my mother because of the part that I'm playing in the class. But she hadn't used her mother. She had accepted this part of herself, and then she realized she saw it for the first time in her mother, and then she saw what allowed her to empathize with her mom. So I've just experienced so much happiness
Absolutely.
as
I
a
think
result of that.
you'll probably find that a lot of criminality is a result of severe repression.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, if you want to take that.
Yeah.
So play is again, it's as necessary as conflict and bias and all these things that we are, you know, and it's part of our differences that we just have to get to know. And play is a great way to do that. You know, pay attention through play.
And it's just such a lifted feeling when you feel connected to everybody else through a particular world in a story. You know, we all have hunger, insatiable desires, and everybody you meet is going to have those insatiable desires, or every single person we meet has hierarchical constructs. So that connectivity then creates this buoyancy, and then allows for the play spirit to happen. Yeah.
I used to have this friend, I mean, I still have this friend, but he doesn't live here anymore. And even as adults, I'm admitting something. One of our favorite secret things to do, we would close the door, we'd be alone, and we'd say, "Do you want to play stupid?" And we'd just be absolutely stupid with each other, you know?
But how do you define stupid?
Next time I'll have
Under
you watch.
what influence?
Okay, last one. What do you advise what do you advise to do if initially you are naturally and immediately connected to a scene or monologue? For example, you cry every time you perform, or say the monologue or scene, you lose that initial connection after 5 to 10 of the readings, or example, you work your way through out of the initial emotional connections and can't find the connection anymore.
Is that for all of us? Or?
Looks like you got an answer. Go for it.
Well, it's a big question.
Yeah.
You know, we were talking about the cumulative effect of daily practice. And the dictionary says the word habit means something you do a lot, and so you get good at it. I think the challenge around for actors, you know, tomorrow I'm going to cry at 4 o'clock because the writer says that's what I'm being asked to do. The focus is on the crying instead of the loss. And then people start to sort of use their own personal losses and imposing their own, personal narrative onto it, and you have protections around those personal losses. But when you step into a pretend reality and you say, I'm willing to empathize with the loss in the story, and you practice consistently empathizing with loss on a daily basis, then it's a wellspring that really never ends. It really never ends. But it has to be practiced every single day. It's not going to happen just because you want it for tomorrow. It's a topic that affects us all, and we have to widen our empathetic embrace around that topic, not just my personal experience of loss, but a wider experience of loss. Yeah.
What's the example you've used before? I've heard you talk about, was it Elizabeth Taylor?
Oh, yeah. That was in the New York Times.
Yeah. What's that story again?
Oh, well, let's see if I can remember the whole story. Yes, she was going to be asked to cry over her horse dying. You remember that movie? And she was Mickey Rooney, right? National Velvet. And Mickey Rooney said, look, I'm going to tell you how to do that. And I want you to think about the fact that your mother has had to take out the wash and that your own father has died. And he goes through this long list of substituting, which of course audiences don't substitute. And she said, she just laughed and said, well, I'm a little girl and my horse is dying. It's that kind of play spirit, childlike spirit. It's a child's game. Isn't it Meryl Streep, who said beautifully at her Barnard commencement speech, empathy is at the heart of the actor's art. Playing pretend is not just play. Playing pretend is imagined possibility. I loved when she said that. That was in 2010. But we've been talking about that for 30 years. Yeah.
Well, I love that on the stage we can put an acting teacher of 30 years, a neuroscientist, and a mediator, and really be talking about the same issues from so many different angles. And I'm curious how it is for each of you. Have you been a part of conversations like this where you're not sitting in a room with a bunch of scientists? Diana, you're with specifically with actors, but not in that room. And Dorit, it sounds like you've got a little bit more crossover through your disciplines. But I'm curious what this night, what this does. What do you think about the conversation that's happening and being able to share it with a room full of artists?
I know that right now I'm going to invite both of you to the theater. And I want to do more of these with my students, really. I would love very much to have more conversation with both of you. Yeah, it would be great. I'm just thrilled, really humbled to meet both of you and to learn from both of you. And I want to learn so much more. So thank you so much.
Lisa, can you share a little bit? Really, this is your first time stepping into a room as a neuroscientist speaking to actors.
Right, but actually, like, there's a lot of studies, again, I'll go back to, that actually show that the arts are a very important way to access empathy. So it's been shown, for example, in high schoolers who are taking an acting class, that through the acting class, their trait empathy actually increases. And in kids who take a ukulele class, they also show more pro-social behavior. At USC, I work at the Brain and Creativity Institute, and we have, my colleague, Asal, has a longitudinal study where she looks at kids who are in intensive music training programs. This is El Sistema, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the LA Phil. So they're intensively training, it's for underrepresented kids. And what she finds is that 4 years of following them, the kids who are doing this kind of intensive music training compared to other kids and compared to kids who are doing soccer show more empathy and more pro-social behavior. So for example, at the end of her studies, she asks the kids, here's a sticker for you. Do you actually want to take some for your friends? And some of the kids will just be like, no, I'm good. I got my sticker. I don't need any more, right? And other kids will be like, really? I know, like, I have like 5 friends who would love a sticker, right? So that's how in kids you can actually measure pro-social behavior. And they find that kids who are part of this El Sistema intensive music program actually ask for more stickers. And they want to give them away to their friends, right? So they have increased pro-social behavior. So the arts are really, really, really important for empathy.
Me?
Yeah.
Well, I came to mediation from art. And late, I went to Pepperdine when I was in my mid-50s to get another master's in conflict studies. But I'd already been a practicing professional artist, working performatively and in immersive installation. And my work had always been about identity and social relations as an artist. And I believe that my work as a mediator is probably more unique than standard because my background is not procedural, it's creative. And it is about play, and it is about exploring deeply my own sensorial and cognitive desires and understanding how to drive them in order to tell a story, which is what actors do. And what I need to do as a mediator is to become artificially neutral in order to help activate a kind of play, well, if I'm lucky, it'll get to play. It's usually to create the safety for each person to tell their story, but then to hang on long enough for me to allow me to explore through tiny questioning what the interests and subtexts are behind their story, which I know as an artist. I know to do that as an artist, because that's what artists do. You're always taking things apart and throwing things against the wall and seeing what sticks and remaking them and unmaking them. And
Diana's nodding. Well, thank you all. Any parting words? You can leave.
how are you?
What's that?
How are you?
How am I? I'm great. I'm really just excited to be here again. The fact that this conversation is happening at SAG-AFTRA Foundation, first of all, thank you, SAG-AFTRA, for using your platform, to have this dialogue, and for all of you who showed up. This conversation was booked up in the first day. I think it's such a cool thing to be amongst friends and comrades and other artists that are hungry for empathy in your work and purpose and mission. Thank you for Diana for really talking, each of you, really bringing that to the forefront. We all need each other, and we need to hear the perspectives of people from all different sectors in order to inform our art so that we can then inform culture and the people around us. So thank you. Thank you.